Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming with in this event with John Maxwell Coetzee, and we are very happy with the possibility of having John here in Spain. This is the first time that he comes for the promotion of a book. He has come to Spain due to different reasons, but never before in order to promote a book. And this is the Cuentos Morales, Moral Tales. We have published it together with Lilo de Ariadna. And the director of the publishing house is here with us. And the novelty, well, we have two novelties in this book. The first one being that he retakes the Elizabeth Costello, and it is published first in Spanish and then in English. It's going to be published. The event is going to take more or less 1 hour, and it's going to be a conversation between him and Isabel and Maria Soledad, sorry, and we are going to if you want to buy a book and you don't want to wait for a queue, you know that John will be signing his books tomorrow as well in Retiro. And well, thank you for having come here.
John, I hope we will be able to have a conversation around your latest book, 7 Moral Tales, which has just been published, but also about your writing of the past 15 years since you moved from South Africa to Australia, some of the themes in your writing. And at a certain point, maybe you could read for us an extract of one of the stories? How does that seem to you?
It seems good. Before we begin, though, let me publicly thank Claudio Lopez Lamadrid and Random House for bringing us to Madrid as part of this tour of Spain. With subsequent appearances in Bilbao and Granada. Shall we proceed?
In one of the interviews in Dublin The Point, you say all writing is autobiography and all autobiography is storytelling. This is an aphorism much quoted nowadays. And in the book there is an autobiographical essay called Remembering Texas. I wonder if you could speak about your significance of your North American education and of that experience to you.
Yes. The essay you mentioned, Remembering Texas, is about the 3 years I spent as a student at the University of Texas. How did I, as a young man from South Africa, come to land up in Texas? The answer is that I took a wrong turning after leaving high school. I decided that I wanted to be a mathematician, and I enrolled at the university and took a degree in mathematics and went to England and worked for several years in the computer industry in England, and then discovered two things. First of all, that I was not as clever as all these mathematicians around me, and secondly, that my mind was starting to work like the mind of a machine, which I thought was very bad and destructive. So I made a decision that I can only admire myself for in retrospect, which was to write to a number of universities in the United States saying, here I am, I took a wrong turn, I want to give up mathematics, I want to become a student of literature, will you accept me? And the University of Texas wrote back saying, okay, come here. And I spent 3 years there working on a doctorate in literature, paid for by the American taxpayer. It wasn't the greatest of educations I received there, but in the library of the University of Texas, I discovered the manuscript of a novel by Samuel Beckett that I admired very much, a novel named What? And I spent much of my doctoral dissertation and analysis of how What had come into being. So, looking back, my relations with the United States have become somewhat more alienated since the 1960s. 1960s were not a good time to be in the United States. It was the time of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of discord in society. The public mood was angry. It wasn't a pleasant time for a foreigner to be in the country. But I'm, in retrospect, very grateful to the university and to the American people for giving me those 3 years in which I could do pretty much what I wanted and read pretty much what I wanted. And that's what the essay is about.
Mm-hmm. Your books are composed in English, and you have made translations from other languages into English. But even as far back as your well-known novel Disgrace, published nearly 20 years ago, you have been expressing a certain skepticism about the English language and trying to distance yourself from it. Can you comment?
Well, as you can imagine, trying to describe one's relationship to the language in which you work professionally is a profound and complicated subject. I have reservations about English at a personal level, at a philosophical level, at a political level too, and it would take a long time to go into all of that, but let me just try to respond to the question of my relations with English at a philosophical level. I don't know whether you're familiar with what is sometimes called the linguistic relativity hypothesis and is sometimes called the Humboldt relativity hypothesis after the German philosopher, or is sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or sometimes the Whorf hypothesis. But essentially, Benjamin Lee Whorf was an American linguist who worked with Native American languages in the 1930s and 1940s, particularly with a tribe called the Hopi. And Whorf claimed that if you make an intensive study of the Hopi language, you'll find that it reflects a view of the universe that is very, very different from that of speakers of Indo-European languages like Spanish or English. By analyzing the structure of the language, Whorf said, you can begin to understand the world view of the Hopi people. Now, this hypothesis, the linguistic relativity hypothesis, is very controversial. Many linguists are dismissive of it. They say it is speculative. They say it's unprovable. But I see it as relevant to the question you were asking about my relations with English. English is in the process of becoming a so-called world language as part of the globalization phenomenon. And many people regard this as a good thing. They say everyone in the world should have a language in common, and English is the best candidate for being the universal language. Well, Worf warns us that, like any other language, English has an embedded worldview within it. And if you start to use a particular language, you start to absorb the worldview that is embedded in the language. Now, there's a Polish-born linguist named Anna Wierzbicka, who has devoted several books to the analysis of the worldview of the English language. It's a project on a large scale which no English speaker could have undertaken, simply because the native English speaker is embedded in the English language and the English worldview. What an outsider might call the English worldview is to the native English speaker simply the way the world is. So it seems to me appropriate that someone from a faraway culture and language like Polish should undertake this project of analyzing and deconstructing the English language. And Wierzbicka concentrates on common phrases in English, or common words in English, like common sense, or statements like, that makes sense to me. English speakers who use the term common sense implicitly believe that there is a standard of judgment that holds universally, which doesn't demand further philosophical analysis. Most problems in the world, they say, can be solved by common sense. Wierzbicka analyzes what common sense actually means, seen from the outside, from the point of view of someone who is a native French speaker or a native Polish speaker or whatever. And she shows how peculiarly Anglo-Saxon this notion of common sense is, how it emerges out of English history and English social practice. And I am very strongly persuaded by the kind of deconstruction that Wierzbicka does. I believe that being enclosed in a single language means being enclosed in a specific worldview. I've, throughout my writing career, worked in English, but as the years have gone on, I've become progressively moved further and further away from the English worldview represented by such concepts as common sense. So it's not the complete answer to your question, but I hope that is part of an answer to your question.
Yes. Your latest novels are The Childhood of Jesus and The School Days of Jesus. Since these two novels are not set in biblical times and do not feature the historical Jesus among their characters, why is the name Jesus in their titles? A broader question. Do you consider yourself to be a Christian writer?
In an ideal world, I would have liked to publish the first of the novels you mentioned, The Childhood of Jesus, without a title, blank title page, and to have allowed the reader to come to the conclusion by the end of the book that it was about the childhood of Jesus. But in the world that we have, it's not possible to publish a book without a title, So there we are. I don't want to spend time explaining these two books. I've always believed that if a book cannot speak for itself, then it is a failure. Once the author has sent a book out into the world, he ought simply to shut up. But I think it's obvious to anyone that the books are not about the historical Jesus, or, to put it in a different way, that the books have no historical basis. But let me turn to your second question, which comes out of the first, I think, which is, do I consider myself to be a Christian writer? Although I was educated in a Catholic school, I don't come from a family that is religious in any sense of the word. My parents never went to church. They never discussed religion at home. It's not that they were atheists, it's simply that they did not find religion relevant to the lives they were leading. And I myself carried that attitude into adult life. I too never went to church. I too did not find religion relevant to my life. Nevertheless, I've always been intrigued and moved by the life, and particularly the death, the self-sacrificial death of Jesus. And I remember being very deeply moved by the film, the Gospel According to Matthew by Pier Paolo Pasolini, which I first saw in my 20s and which I watched again and again. Pasolini's Jesus was not the Jesus of institutional religion. He was a wild, intense, but fragile young man. At the same time that I was watching Pasolini, I was reading René Girard on the subject of violence. And Girard, although a Jew himself, was strongly influenced by Jesus. And Girard's great political theme was that the cycle of violence and counter-violence in human societies can be broken only by exemplary self-sacrifice of the kind that Jesus preached and practiced. So, to come back to your question, am I a Christian writer? Without being a believer in any sense of the word, without being a member of any church, I'm someone who's been influenced in many ways by Christian thought, and I'm someone who is very interested in what Jesus has to say, both the Jesus of the Gospels, which are, I find, very, very difficult texts to read and interpret, and the Jesus that one absorbs simply by being brought up in a Christian culture.
Your latest book, 7 Moral Tales, Siete Cuentos Morales, comes out first in Spanish. Is this a meaningful gesture on your part, or am I reading too much into the story?
Publishing first in Spanish and publishing particularly first in Argentina is indeed a gesture and an intended gesture. Whether it is a significant gesture, I am in no position to say. But let me try to place this book, the Siete Cuentos, in context. As I look back over my career as a writer, which now extends over 5 decades, this is what I see. I see a young man who is born in South Africa, of an ethnicity which is a little hard to define, because at first approximation he looks like an Afrikaner, but then he lacks several of the characteristic properties of being an Afrikaner identity. This young man starts writing fiction in an acquired language, namely English. He finds a publisher in South Africa, a small publisher. He sells a few thousand copies of his books. He wins local prizes, but he's got larger ambitions. His ambition is to be published in the real world, which to him means London, but particularly it means New York. Then at the age of 40, he makes a breakthrough. He writes a book called Waiting for the Barbarians, which becomes a minor bestseller in the United States. And thereafter, his books are published concurrently in London and New York as they come out. And then they're translated into foreign languages, that is, languages other than English. So he's become what is known in the book trade as an international author, a term which does not have a precise meaning except that to be an international author, you cannot be British or American. You've got to be something else. This person I'm talking about, as he grows older, as history progresses, becomes more and more alienated from the United States, particularly the United States of George Bush Jr. He dislikes the complacent belief of North Americans that their way of life and their culture is destined to take over the globe. As for England, where he has lived and worked as well, he feels entirely alienated when he is there. He loses interest in the way his books are read and perceived in English-speaking countries. He becomes more interested in the way that they're received elsewhere in the world. He works closely with his translators. He begins to think of himself as an international author, but in a different sense. Someone who is located not in any particular language or any particular country. It's no longer clear to him why his book should come out first in English and then later in other languages. And he tries the experiment of publishing his books in Dutch translation before they're published in English. Then he finds in Argentina a sympathetic publisher, El Gilo de Ariadna, and he entertains the idea of publishing in the South, that is, in Spanish in Latin America and in English in Australia, and letting the North wait its turn to, if it is still interested in reading him. And so we have the Siete cuentos. We also have the books that you mentioned, the childhood of Jesus, the school days of Jesus, in which people who find themselves in the next life discover that the language one speaks there is not English, but Spanish.
Elizabeth Costello, who figures in a number of the stories in Siete Cuentos Morales, has appeared in earlier books of yours in between 1999, when she first appeared, and the present. Has she changed or evolved as a character?
Some years ago, a friend of mine, an Australian friend of mine, a writer, went on a lecture tour of India, speaking to university audiences, and after one of his lectures, a member of the audience put up his hand and said, "Sir, can you tell us something about this Australian writer named Elizabeth Costello?" I mention this story because it shows how a purely fictional being can start to take up residence in the real world, and also shows how a fictional creation can escape the control of her creator. So let me try to respond to your question about the evolution of Elizabeth Costello. As you mentioned, she first appeared in the year 1999, when I was invited to give 2 lectures at a university in the United States, and presented 2 lectures in which a writer is invited to give 2 lectures at a university in the United States. The writer in this case was Elizabeth Costello. In the years that followed, I wrote several more pieces in which Elizabeth Costello figured, and her biography began to expand. She acquired an older sister who was a nun. She took up residence in Spain and led a more and more isolated existence in a village. Her son and daughter grew worried about her. They tried to persuade her to leave her new home and move to a city with better medical facilities, and she resisted all their efforts. These stories appeared to me, so to speak, and Elizabeth's life grew of its own accord, so to speak. I'm not sure that I've ever had control over Elizabeth. In the novel that I wrote called Slow Man, this absence of authorial control was signaled by the way in which Elizabeth Costello appears without warning and without invitation in the book in the life of the main character. And in a similar way, she appeared without warning or invitation in my own life, demanding entry into the world. I'm well aware that this way of talking about fictional characters as demanding entry into the real world is metaphorical, that it's a shorthand way of speaking about something that is much less mystical and much more complicated. But it seems to me there's nothing wrong intrinsically about talking in metaphors.
Broadly speaking, Elizabeth Costello is skeptical and about human reason, rationality, which in her opinion has led humankind to the brink of disaster. To our faculty of reason, she opposes our faculty of sympathy, which she thinks we do not cultivate enough. Can you explain what she means by our faculty of sympathy and why it is so important to her?
Well, I think we must begin by saying that Elizabeth Costello herself is not a simpatica person. She's, on the contrary, she can be arrogant, she can be overbearing, she can be intolerant. But she does believe that what makes the lives, the inner lives of other living beings accessible to us, and other beings here includes non-human beings as well as human beings. What makes that possible is our faculty of sympathy, that is, our capacity to reach out imaginatively and enter the lives of others and live them, even if only briefly, from the inside. She opposes sympathy to rationality. She believes that the faculty of rationality is overblown. In particular, she believes that a rational approach to relations with other people and other beings in general is not only limiting but also potentially destructive. Thus, for instance, she believes that a purely rational approach to farming, expressed in a science of agricultural economics, leads to a world of cruelty on an unimaginable scale.
In one of the interviews published in your book, Cartas de Navegación, you describe yourself as a person of the left who is, nevertheless, alienated by political language. You have accordingly chosen in the Siete cuentos, Morales, and elsewhere to address questions of a broadly political nature through the language of fiction. Do you think that political questions, and more broadly philosophical questions, can be addressed adequately in the medium of fiction?
The book that you refer to, Cartas de Navegación, dates from 20 years ago. But as regards the passage that you quote from it, I would still endorse that. I'm in broad sympathy with the concerns of the left. I'm also bored and alienated by the language of politics. The stories of mine that seem on the surface to address political or moral questions do not seem to me to be about politics or morality as such. They're about people who are going through crises of one kind or another, usually moral crises with a political colouring. So my position is in broad concord with the position that Elizabeth Costello takes, namely not rational analysis of what one might call a problem or a question. For instance, the question of how one should respond to industrial farming, but sympathetic exploration of what it is like to undergo a crisis facing such a problem. So specifically, in several of the stories related to Elizabeth Costello, I explore her feelings, her feeling that her own views on the way in which human beings treat animals, her own views might be so idiosyncratic, so extreme, that she may be placing herself outside the human community, and indeed may be losing her mind. That a feeling that she, who has always been so sure that she is right, may have been wrong all the time.
In several of your stories about Elizabeth Costello, Elizabeth's two children, now middle-aged, try to persuade her to accept that she is growing old, that she may soon be in need of care, and therefore that she should move into some kind of facility for the aged. Elizabeth resists all their efforts. Where should our sympathies lie as readers of these stories, with the parent or with their children?
As you said, the two children, the two grown-up children, one living in the United States, one living in France, grow disturbed about their mother's, the life their mother is living. Who is going to take care of her if she falls ill? What will happen if she slips and breaks a limb? So they try to persuade her to leave her village home and move to one of those places that in English is called an aged care facility. And of course she resists their efforts. Several of the Siete cuentos grow out of this struggle between the mother and her children, which is a struggle that is becoming more and more common in the modern world, where families are small and it's no longer the custom for a parent to come and live with one or other of the children when she grows old. In real life, I suppose our sympathies usually lie with the parent, because we know that life in one of these facilities will probably be miserable. But as a person who may soon be in need of an aged care facility myself, my testimony really cannot be trusted, so maybe the children are right.
Okay. In your story, The Old Woman and the Cat, Elizabeth Costello says, a cat has a soul, but not a character. Could you explain?
Let me be brief. People who are fond of cats and dogs commonly claim that each animal has a unique character. This is not true, or so it seems to me. Animals undoubtedly have individual traits. And if the animal is treated as a pet, is usually encouraged to express these individual traits. But a set of a few easily recognized traits does not add up to a character in the sense that each human being has an individual character. So that's why I say cats do not have a character, and agree with Elizabeth Costello. More controversial is her claim that an animal has a soul. And here I think she expresses a position that is common in Catholic theology, that animals have souls, though not immortal souls. What is interesting is the contrast between that position and the Cartesian position, which is that animals are machines made not of metal but of flesh and blood. I wonder whether this isn't a good point for me to read part of the story that you refer to.
Yes,
Yeah.
let's do that.
And perhaps I can read sections in English and you can translate them as we go.
Okay. Reading
So the situation is that Elizabeth's son, John, is speaking to her. "How many cats are you feeding?" he asks her. "It depends on the time of year," she replies. "At present, I feed 12 regulars plus some occasional visitors. In summer, the numbers drop." "But surely, as you feed them, they multiply." "They multiply," she agrees. "That is the nature of healthy organisms."
John habla. ¿A cuántos gatos alimentas?, le pregunta a su madre. «Depende de la época del año», responde ella. «En este momento unos 10 permanentes más algunos visitantes ocasionales. En verano son menos». «Seguramente mientras tú los alimentas ellos se multiplican». «Sí, se multiplican», ella consiente. «Es algo natural en todos los organismos sanos».
"They multiply geometrically," he says. "I can see why your fellow villagers are perturbed. A stranger moves into their village and starts feeding the feral cats, and before long there is a plague of cats. Is there not a certain equilibrium that you are upsetting? And what of the horses that must end up as cat food so that you can feed these cats of yours? Do you spare a thought for the horses?"
Se multiplican geométricamente, dice él. Sea como fuere, es evidente por qué los aldeanos están inquietos. Una extranjera se instala en la aldea y empieza a alimentar a los gatos silvestres. Al poco tiempo hay una verdadera plaga de gatos. ¿No será que estás alterando un estado de equilibrio anterior? ¿Y qué hay de los caballos que acaban en el matadero para que puedas alimentar a estos gatos tuyos? ¿Les has dedicado algún pensamiento?
"What do you want me to do, John?" says his mother. "Do you want me to let the cats starve? Do you want me to feed only a select few? Do you want me to feed them tofu instead of animal flesh? What are you saying?" "You could begin by having them neutered," he replies. "If you had them captured and neutered, one and all, at your own expense, then your neighbors in the village might actually thank you instead of cursing you beneath their breath. The last generation of cats, the neutered one, could live out their lives contentedly, and that would be the end of it."
¿Qué quieres que haga, John?, dice su madre. ¿Quieres que deje morir de hambre a los gatos? ¿Quieres que les dé de comer a unos pocos selectos? ¿Que les dé de comer queso de soja en lugar de carne? ¿Qué quieres decirme? Podrías empezar por castrarlos. Él responde: si los hicieras capturar y castrar a todos sin excepción, a tu costa, es probable que tus vecinos de la aldea te lo agradecieran en lugar de maldecirte entre dientes. La última generación de gatos, los castrados, podrían vivir complacidos y ahí terminaría todo.
A win-win situation, in fact. His mother sounds sharp. Yes, if you want to put it that way. A win-win situation from which I emerge as a shining example of how the problem of feral cats can be addressed rationally and responsibly, and yet with humanity. He is silent.
Una situación en la que todos ganan. De hecho, la voz de la madre suena ácida, si quieres decirlo así. Una situación en la que todos ganan, que me muestras como ejemplo de cómo se puede abordar el problema de los gatos silvestres con racionalidad y responsabilidad, y también con sensibilidad humana. El hijo no dice nada.
I don't want to be an example, John. In his mother's voice, he hears the beginning of the hard, insistent edge that he privately thinks of as obsessional. Let other people be examples. I follow where my soul leads me. I always have. If you don't understand that about me, you don't understand anything. When the word soul is employed, I generally cease to understand, he says. I apologize for that.
No quiero ser un ejemplo, John. En la voz de su madre, él advierte los primeros matices de este tono insistente, filoso, que para sus adentros él piensa obsesivo. Que otros sean un ejemplo. Voy a donde me lleva mi alma. Siempre lo he hecho. Y si no entiendes eso de mi persona, no entiendes nada. Por lo general, dejo de entender cuando alguien usa la palabra alma, dice él. Pido disculpas al respecto. Es consecuencia de la educación excesivamente racional que tuve.
He does not share his mother's obsession with animals. Faced with a choice between the interests of human beings and the interests of animals, he will choose without hesitation for human beings, for his own kind. Benign but distant. That is how he would describe his attitude to animals. Distant because, when all is said and done, there is a vast distance fixed between the human and the rest. If it were up to him alone to solve the problem of this village and its plague of cats, if his mother were no longer involved in no way, if his mother were deceased, for example, he would say, kill them all. He would say, exterminate the brutes. Feral cats, feral dogs, the world does not need any more of them. But, since his mother is involved, he says nothing.
No comparte la obsesión de la madre con los animales. Si él tuviera que elegir entre los intereses de los seres humanos y los de los animales, no vacilaría en optar por los seres humanos, por su propia especie. Benévola pero distante, así describiría él su actitud hacia los animales. Distante porque, considerando todos los aspectos de la cuestión, hay aún una enorme distancia entre los seres humanos y los demás seres. Si él pudiera resolver a su manera el problema de esa aldea y la plaga de gatos, si no estuviera involucrada su madre, Si ella hubiera muerto, por ejemplo, diría: matadlos a todos, exterminad a esas bestias. Eso diría: gatos salvajes, perros salvajes. El mundo no necesita ninguno más. Pero, como está involucrada la madre, no dice nada. So in the story that you've been reading, Elizabeth Costello reveals that she is disliked by the people of the village in Spain, where she has taken up residence, because she has been taking feral cats into her home and thus promoting a population explosion among the village's cats. Do the villagers not have a point? And might a similar point not be made about the vegetarianism which Elizabeth advocates? If human beings stopped killing and eating cattle, sheep, pigs and poultry, what would become of all these creatures, spared from the butcher's knife? Who would feed them and take care of them?
The villagers indeed do have a point. By providing a home for the wild cats and allowing them to breed in an uncontrolled way, Elizabeth is upsetting an ecological balance. Elizabeth herself understands this very well. Nevertheless, she persists in acting in a way that is, ecologically speaking, reckless. To justify her actions, she uses imagery of unborn souls waiting at the gate for a chance to enter the world and experience life, life than which there is no higher good. Who are we, says Elizabeth, to dictate who will be allowed to live and who will not? Let me mention, as I'm sure you've recognized, that this is one of the stronger arguments made by opponents of abortion. A similar accusation of recklessness can be made against the vegetarianism that Elizabeth advocates. What indeed is going to happen to the billions of cattle in the world, to take just the case of cattle, if we suddenly stopped killing them for food? Do we really expect the world's farmers to go on feeding them and caring for them and their progeny indefinitely into the future? Cattle are domesticated animals. They're incapable of taking care of themselves. They will simply die of starvation. Is that a better fate than having their throats cut? As I said earlier, my interest is not so much in the abstract question of whether we should kill and eat animals, so much as in the situation of an intelligent person, in this case Elizabeth Costello, who is wrestling in a moral and intellectual sense with the question.
To change the subject completely, is the discipline of psychoanalysis of any importance to you as a writer?
Is the discipline of psychoanalysis important to me as a writer? I would say it is more important to me as a thinker than to me as a writer. Someone who thinks about the nature of truth, someone who thinks about us as moral beings. But, let me mention, since you asked the question of whether I have an interest in psychoanalysis, that you have been the publisher of a book that I co-authored, whose title was, in Spanish, Buen Relato, in English, The Good Story, subtitle, exchanges on truth, fiction, and psychotherapy. And as you know, that book commences with the question, what does psychoanalytic psychotherapy seek to achieve? Now, Sigmund Freud is claimed to have said that if a therapist can send a patient back out into the world capable of working and loving, then the therapy can be regarded as successful therapy. And the question that troubled me and my co-author, the British psychoanalyst Arabella Coetzee, was this: if the goal of psychoanalysis is this practical goal of sending people out into the world to function, working and loving, is it necessary that psychoanalysis should bring the patient to confront the truth about himself or herself? Is it not enough for the therapist to send the patient out into the world with an empowering fiction about himself or herself? Why should the patient and the therapist not collaborate to produce a life story for the patient that may or may not be true, but that will help the patient to function? That was question one. The second question that we addressed in the book was the question of repression. And the question we asked was, is it true that the repressed always re-emerges? This is the famous return of the repressed. Or can people successfully repress aspects of their past that they find unpleasant to face? Are there not cases where people quite happily forget the past and reinvent themselves? And the crucial cases we had in mind in writing the book were people who'd been involved in acts of cruelty, for example, as torturers or prison guards or whatever. People who had committed terrible acts and then retired, moved to the suburbs, and seemed to be leading perfectly ordinary lives there. Now, the orthodox theory of repression would say that some part of the evil that they had committed had to re-emerge to make their lives unhappy. And the question we asked was, is it not possible for a torturer to retire and live a happy life and die a peaceful death? A third, I'll just name three aspects of the book that seem to me important. A third aspect that we took up was historical in nature. I have had homes in South Africa and Australia and have spent many years in the United States. All these countries have behind them a history of subjugating and expropriating native peoples. How should the present generation feel about their ancestors who did this subjugating and expropriating? And here we touch on questions of guilt and again of repression. And let me frame the question in the simplest possible way. Our grandparents or great-grandparents were, in terms of today's thinking, criminals. They indulged in theft and in some cases in violence and murder. But these grandparents or great-grandparents of ours did not think of themselves as criminals. On the contrary, they thought of themselves as involved in a civilizing mission. They were claiming a new land for civilization. They were bringing the gospel to the heathen. So the present generation feels or ought to feel great ambivalence toward their ancestors. These ancestors were, on the one hand, criminals, but on the other hand, they thought of themselves as good people, just as we today think of ourselves as good people. Now, how is this ambivalence toward the past, handled at a psychological level. And in the book, I suggest that we handle it by telling ourselves the following story. Number one, our forefathers did bad things, but they are not to be blamed because they were in the grip of false, unenlightened beliefs. Number two, because of universal progress, we have more modern and more enlightened beliefs than our forefathers. And then, number three, we say, if in the future, as history unfolds, we are revealed to be as deeply mistaken and unenlightened as our forefathers were, there's nothing we can do about it. Because it's in the nature of history that there's just one story after another, each one supplanting the one before. Therefore, the best thing to do is to forget or repress the whole matter and get on with our lives. Here we have an example of a group, perhaps an entire society, practicing repression. And the question I ask is this: when a society feels that it has no duty to feel troubled about the past, when in effect the society refuses to enter therapy, can a healing process ever begin?
Last question. Praying is a way of talking with the unknown. Maybe writing has a similarity to praying?
I think that is an interesting idea. Praying is a form of discourse which, as far as I know, appears in every human society. But it's puzzling because it is addressed to a you who may not be present in any observable way. Yet as far as I'm aware, theorists of discourse have not a great deal to say about the subject of prayer. Is writing like prayer? Seems to me there are ways in which the two are indeed alike. In both cases, it's hard to specify to whom one's discourse is addressed. It's quite possible that it is addressed to no one. Also, both prayer and writing are disciplines. In writing, you have to subject yourself to the blankness of the page and wait patiently to hear whether the blankness answers you. Sometimes the blankness does not answer, and then, you know, despair.
Thank you.